We have Paula Caplan on the line from Cambridge, Massachusetts. Paula, I actually heard Paula speak last year at a Mind Freedom activism conference. I think it was at George Washington University of Law. It was some law school in Washington, D.C., and I was just completely blown away. Paula is one of the best speakers, most intelligent, powerful, inspiring speakers that I've ever run across in doing 5 years of mental health activism, and she has an incredible track record. She is a clinical and research psychologist with honors from Radcliffe College of Harvard University. She got her MA and PhD from Duke University, and she's now a lecturer at Harvard teaching psychology of sex and gender. She's got a tremendously insightful and powerful feminist analysis of psychiatry that we're going to be hearing about and will blow you away. We could do 5 hours with Paula Caplan and not cover even a small portion of what it is that she is all about. So we're going to try and scratch the surface tonight. Just to give you a sense, her books include not just criticizing the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, although that's the main thing her public work has been associated with, but she's a very accomplished psychologist in the realm of gender and also children. Her books include Children's Learning and Attention Problems, Between Women, Lowering the Barriers, The Myth of Women's Masochism, Don't Blame Mother, Mending the Mother-Daughter Relationship, which is actually now out in a second edition, Lifting a Ton of Feathers, A Woman's Guide to Surviving in the Academic World, You're Smarter Than They Make You Feel, How the Experts Intimidate Us and What We Can Do About It, Thinking Critically About Research on Sex and Gender, and the one that she's most famous for, at least in terms of mental health activism, They Say You're Crazy, How the World's Most Powerful Psychiatrists Decide Who's Normal. So we're going to try and get Paula on the phone here. Paula, can you hear us?
Barely. It's a little soft.
Okay. How are we now?
That's better.
Welcome to the show. It's really a tremendous honor. I was just, I don't think you could hear that, but I was just singing your praises and saying how excited I am to have you.
Okay. Well, I'm thrilled to be doing this.
Yeah, it's really great. We had a really tremendous event last year with Paula. We were able to get about 150 people over at a hall in Hampshire College talking about bias in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, race, class, and gender bias. And wow, I'm really not quite sure where to begin. Maybe, Paula, you could just say a little bit about how you got into this work
Yes.
to begin with.
Yes, okay. Well, I had written a book called The Myth of Women's Masochism, in which I was basically saying that I've never met anyone who actually enjoyed suffering. Masochism is just a stupid idea.
So just for people who maybe don't know the masochism.
Masochism, it was defined as enjoyment of suffering or pleasure from pain. And, by definition, you don't enjoy it if it's suffering, right? And I was very concerned about the way that people who were suffering were said to be suffering because they enjoyed it and they must have brought it on themselves. And so I had written this book, and when it was about to be published, I heard that the American Psychiatric Association was revising its diagnostic manual, and that they were proposing to put in there a new category called masochistic personality disorder. And I couldn't believe it. I was appalled. So I got involved in that way, and then over the next few years, through a strange chain of events, I ended up being asked to be a consultant to two of the committees that were going to write the edition of the psychiatric manual that came out in 1994.
Mm-hmm. So for people who don't know, can you just tell us a little bit about what the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual is? Because it's probably the single most important document that psychiatry uses, but people may not know exactly how that kind of plays out.
That's right. By the way, I'm having a little bit of trouble hearing. If there's a way to turn up the volume. The Psychiatric Diagnostic Manual is affectionately known as the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. And you hear from the word statistical, it sounds like it's science, which nothing could be further from the truth. I'll talk about that in a little bit. But in any case, it's known as the mental health professional's Bible, because just about any place in this country, if you want to see a therapist, and if you have insurance that will cover the therapy, they are going to give you a label as having some sort of psychiatric illness, and it's extremely likely to come from the DSM. It's the most commonly used one, and it's translated into at least 24 languages by now. It's used in countries all over the world, including China, and because it is advertised as a scientific document, it's marketed that way. People think it is. I used to think that before I was on the committees and saw how it's put together. And it consists of, the current edition has 374 different labels for alleged mental illnesses. And there's everything in there from stuttering, math disability, nicotine dependence disorder. These are all supposedly mental illnesses.
Mathematics disability, like math in school?
Pardon?
Mathematics disability, like
like a reading, like learning disability, like reading disability. That's in there too. And all as not, which is not to say that people don't suffer. It's not to say that people don't have math disabilities and that people don't stutter and so on, and that people don't get dependent on nicotine. But are we going to call everything mental illnesses? And in a way, one of the categories that I think is the most terrifying and poignant is that if somebody close to you leaves you or dies, and you're still grieving 2 months later, then you qualify for the mental illness of major depressive disorder. You want to say, wait a minute, of course you're still grieving 2 months. That's human.
But one and a half months later, you're not considered mentally ill. But once you hit 2 months, that's the cutoff line.
That's another excellent point. Is that each of these categories that's in there, 374 categories, each one has, you've got to picture this, a title for the label, a 4 or 5 digit code, numerical code with a decimal point in there, so that looks very precise. And then a list of the criteria for this alleged disorder, and then a cutoff point that goes something like this. If the patient has 6 of the following 9 symptoms, then you give them this label. But if they only have 5, they don't. How are those numbers chosen? How are those symptoms chosen? Well, you would think it was all scientific. There's this very heavy aura of scientific precision that surrounds the DSM. It's heavy. It's 3 pounds. It weighs 3 pounds. And people don't know that it's not scientific. And as I say, I used to teach it as an advocate to my graduate students. Isn't it wonderful? Somebody has read all of the empirical research about emotional problems, and they've thrown out the stuff that's badly done and that doesn't tell us anything. And then the results of what the science shows are in this book. And then when I was on 2 of those committees, I tell you, to say briefly, I've written one book and edited another book about this topic. So and wrote a play about it. So there's lots to say, but the brief version is, when they say it's scientifically based, nothing could be further from the truth. I saw them ignore good scientific research. I saw them treat bad scientific research so bad that if I told a 6th grade kid about one of these studies, they would say, well, that's bad science. I mean, you can't really conclude anything from that. I've seen them take bad research and treat it as though it proved something that proves something, and that was what they did when they wanted support for something they wanted to put in the DSM, and there wasn't good scientific research supporting it. I've seen them distort research. I've seen them out and out lie about it. So
you're talking about your direct experience, having been on the committee, yeah. That's
right. That's my direct experience, and I'm talking about this is all documented. When you use the word lie in a book, the publisher's lawyers usually get very, very nervous. But I had just enormous amounts of documentation of everything, and most of the documentation was stuff that the DSM people had written themselves and sent to me as minutes, as letters and memos and so on. And if you take if you picture the whole enterprise of psychiatric diagnosis, picture it as like a sphere or something, and if you picture taking out an enormous chunk of it that's supposed to be science, but it isn't. So you take that out, and what happens, you've created a vacuum. And into that vacuum goes every conceivable kind of bias. And let me tell you how that happens. I'm a patient. I come to see you, Will. You're a therapist. And
God forbid.
And you have to decide. I want my insurance to cover the therapy, and I'm unhappy. I'm upset. I'm suffering. So, on humane grounds, you're going to have to diagnose me. So, if you're going to give me a diagnostic label, then you may not know that some of these labels are based on sexism or racism or ageism or ableism or classism or homophobia. And if you do know that, whether or not you know that, you might be, not you will, but the therapists, some therapists are, well, all therapists are biased. We're all human, right? So we all have our own biases and our own subjectivities. But some therapists are racist, and some are ageist, and some are sexist, and so on. And it has been proven that depending on your age and sex and race and so on, you are more or less likely to get certain kinds of diagnostic labels. For example, there was a very interesting phenomenon and quite frightening, I think, that was described recently, that that black men who were actually feeling sad or depressed were more likely than white men who were having the same feelings to be diagnosed as schizophrenic rather than depressed. And one of the reasons was apparently that if it's a black man talking to a white therapist, then for historical reasons, they were less likely to make eye contact with the therapist. So then the therapist, maybe consciously or unconsciously, wasn't comfortable with that person, thought, oh, they won't even look me in the eye, and they must be really sick. So they would give them these much more severe kinds of labels. And there are lots of examples of sexism and ageism and so on as well. So if you imagine all of that operating, and then add to that one more concern, which is this. In the DSM, when they describe the various symptoms, they will say very often things like, this person has marked anxiety, M-A-R-K-E-D, marked anxiety. Now, what is that supposed to mean? That, significant anxiety. So, all right, not minor anxiety, but Will, you tell me, who decides where to draw the line? When does it go from being, say, mild or moderate to marked anxiety? It's completely up to the therapist to make that subjective judgment. And frankly, if the therapist likes you, they might be more likely to say you're mentally ill because they want to get you the diagnosis because they want to be able to help you and get your therapy paid for. Or if they like you, they might be less likely to give you that label because they are less likely to see you as mentally ill. But either way, we're not dealing with science and we're not dealing with objectivity.
So how does because I know that you were on these committees, how exactly does the process go for them putting all the different diagnoses together? And I remember you told a very interesting story about the evolution of the DSM and why they did some revisions and sort of how it has sort of come to be what it is today.
Okay, I'm not. There's so many stories. I'm not sure which one in particular, but the DSM started out about 50 years ago as a very, very brief document. And then there was a second edition of it. And then when they decided to have a third edition, it was because here's what's happened. Psychiatrists, have MDs, but they tended to be sort of looked down on by the people with with MDs who were in other specialties. I'm a cancer doctor, or I'm a radiologist, or I run blood tests and do X-rays, and so I'm dealing with science here, and you psychiatrists aren't. And so they were sort of low on the totem pole for doctors. And then also there was this burgeoning of people going into various disciplines to become therapists. So more and more people were becoming psychologists, more were becoming social workers, more were becoming certified marital and family counselors. Clergy were becoming pastoral counselors. And the psychiatrists thought, wait a minute, they're taking over our territory here. So we have to set ourselves apart. And I think some of them thought this consciously, and others it was unconscious for. And Robert Spitzer was a psychiatrist who said, all right, we're going to do a new edition of the DSM, and it's going to be very scientific. And we're going to increase the number of categories because, and at first, it makes logical sense. The principle of it does. He said the more specific we can be about what a person's diagnosis is, the more specific we can be about figuring out what's going to help them. Now, of course, in principle, that's true. It's beautiful. It's like if you figure out, does somebody have a sprained ankle or a broken ankle? You treat those things differently, right? Now, the problem is that in in the field of emotional problems, it's not very much is known at all about what is helpful to people who are suffering based on their diagnosis. What is known is that almost no matter what somebody is going through or how they're reacting to it, if they're having a rough time, what is known is that having somebody, and it doesn't need to be a therapist, having somebody listen carefully and respectfully and be supportive and think carefully about what it is the person's saying. Do you think there's any kind of perspective that might help them if you suggest it? Reading about what kinds of things have been helpful to somebody who's feeling the way they are, and not wearing blinders, as so many mental health professionals do today. Not all of them, but if you read, the New York Times had a big study recently that they wrote about. They said, I think it was an NIMH, National Institutes of Mental Health, government study, federal government study. They said they were investigating what helps teenagers who are depressed. Is it therapy or medication or both? And I was reading that article and I thought, what's bothering me about this? And then I thought, well, of course, I know what's wrong. They offered two options or a combination of the two.
Right.
They didn't say, does having friends help? They didn't say, does meditating help? Or taking an acting class, or drawing pictures,
or having parents with higher incomes.
Yes, excellent point. Right. So the whole, as a whole, the mental health field in general is very blindered, and so we don't think broadly in terms of what is helpful. But more importantly, and not more importantly, but in addition to that, here's what's happened with research. When people try to find out what's helpful to people who are suffering emotionally, what's happened is that it's very hard to do research on people's emotions and behavior for some reasons that are apparent right away, one of which is that, you need a control group. If you're going to see if this medication works or if meditation works, and you've got 10 very sad or very depressed people, you gotta give half of them the treatment you're investigating, and the other half you're supposed to use a placebo for. But is that ethical? I mean, do we really want to deny people something that could possibly help them? So there are ethical problems. Then if you try to study people's feelings and behavior in real life, there's so many factors that you can't control for. They used to say, oh, homosexuality was caused by overprotective, smothering mothers and distant fathers. Well, how do you figure that? You go into the field, and how are you going to decide whose mother and father are how? And they're going to let you into their homes. And so doing research out in the field, there's so much you can't control for. There's so much you can't find out. But if you take people into a laboratory at a university and try and study their feelings and behavior there, well, you might find out how they feel and behave in the laboratory, but that might have no bearing on what happens in the real world. So it's just very hard to get good research done about people's emotional problems. Now, that means that that sort of lays a shaky foundation for figuring out what labels should we be giving people and what kinds of things are helpful to them depending on the labels. Then you've got the fact that the labels are not based on the scientific research. There's not much that's good, and they ignore what's good if it doesn't suit their purposes. And then you've got the fact that although it says in the DSM, follow these rules, they have to meet 6 of the 9 criteria before you give this label, lots of therapists don't do that. And I'm not even saying they're wrong to ignore that, because it means they're taking something that looks scientific and they're not treating it like it's science, and that's right, because it isn't. So
I think the story that you told was something about how there was a revision of the DSM that was intended to make it more accurate.
Oh yes, okay,
yeah.
Okay, all right. And so here's what happens. They appoint huge numbers of people, committees and subcommittees and work groups and so on, and they're all supposed to read all this literature and then have conversations with each other about what should go in the next edition and what shouldn't go in. And the truth is that after all that work is done, there's about a handful, maybe a dozen, people at the top, and they're almost or virtually all men and white and American and almost all psychiatrists who might, that homogeneous-sounding group might have a wide variety of perspectives anyway, but the fact is they don't very much. So they make the final decisions about what gets in and what doesn't. Well, when they were going to do the DSM-3, Robert Spitzer, the head of DSM-3, said, all right, we're going to add all these categories so we will be more precise in assigning diagnoses. And they got money from the MacArthur Foundation to do research on this. So they set out to show how the DSM-3 with huge numbers, more categories, was more, you could be more accurate in diagnosing your patients than with the DSM-2. But here's the problem. Here's how they did the research. They would give 2 therapists the same file from a patient, or they would have 2 therapists interview a patient together. And then they would say, okay, using the DSM-3, what diagnosis do you give them? Now, you're hoping, of course, that they're going to agree. And they decided something like, I forget what the original figure was, but they figured that about 90% of the time, the 2 therapists would agree. But it turned out they didn't. They only agreed about 70% of the time. So they lowered their standard, and they wrote it up, and they said, we did this research, and we found that they agreed 70% of the time, which is really good, they said, like claiming that it was good would make it a good high level. But then, more than that, they had other problems. In order to get them to agree 70% of the time, even that often, which is 70% is not all that great when you think about how somebody's future can be at stake here. But even in order to get the therapists agreeing 70% of the time, here's what they did. Now, picture the DSM has just DSM-2 had a small number of categories. Now, here's the DSM-3 with, a couple of hundred maybe. And in order to get so many more, they had big categories, and they had subcategories of those. Now, in order to get the therapist's agreement up to 70%, they had to ignore the subcategories. Now, what that means is they didn't really need the DSM-3. They were accurate up to 70% of the time using the DSM-2, the earlier edition. And one of the other kinds of things they did was a lot of the people that they had them diagnose had problems like substance abuse disorder. Well, you know what? People with substance abuse don't usually go to a clinic or a therapist on their own. Somebody's sending them, or the court is ordering them because they've been picked up for drunken driving or something. So often there's information there that tells you what the problem is. And then also, some people get picked up off the street and brought to these emergency rooms or walk-in clinics, and they're reeking of alcohol, or their pupils are dilated like crazy because they're drug abusers. So it's really easy to diagnose, and so that increased the frequency of the two therapists agreeing. Now picture this. Well, if you and I, as you said, heaven forbid, if we're both therapists, and somebody comes to see us, and we have to diagnose this person. If you diagnose them with diagnosis X, and I say, no, they have diagnosis Y, then how do we decide how to treat them? Based on your diagnosis or my diagnosis? And so, in other words, it's absolutely essential, if we're going to figure out what kinds of help are effective for people, then we have to agree to begin with on, well, what kinds of problems are they having?
Yeah, so it sounds like the science that goes into the DSM is really non-existent, and then the actual application of it is very arbitrary.
That's right.
And there are tremendous implications. I mean, the difference between getting a PTSD diagnosis and getting a depression diagnosis is huge, for example, or the difference between getting a depression and a borderline personality disorder diagnosis. Do you want to talk a little bit about the sexism that goes in? Because I know that's one of your main focus in looking at the way in which there's gender bias going on in the DSM.
Right, although I'm really alarmed right now because they're preparing for DSM-5 now, and they have a proposal now they've made to put racism in there as a mental illness. So that's another thing they do, is they take social ills and evils, violence, and the consequences of violence, poverty, racism, sexism, and they put those consequences in the book as mental illnesses. And when you say somebody has a mental illness, the implication is very strong that the problem comes from within that individual.
Right.
And so there is massive covering up of social problems, politically caused problems, and if we're putting all of these people on psychotropic medications to cure what are supposedly their individual psychological problems, then it means that we're never going to get at solving some of these major social problems.
So defining racism as a mental illness takes away from focusing on institutional causes and institutional solutions, and just sees it as a problem of individual individual bigotry or individual hatred or individual pathology, rather than looking at the historical, larger political economic forces that are going on.
That's right. And you can imagine what would happen if that goes in the DSM, because if racism goes in, then if somebody is charged with committing a hate crime, then you know what the defense attorney is going to say. This person is mentally ill. This is a mitigating circumstance. Don't send them to jail. Just send them to see a therapist. I mean, it's very frightening. Okay, so about sexism. Where do I begin?
Yeah.
Maybe I should give you a little, like a case study of one of the most sexist diagnoses. I've been told that two guys who were psychiatrists on a fishing trip got the idea to create a new mental illness label
called premenstrual dysphoric disorder. Now, premenstrual, obvious meaning, dysphoric means feeling bad. So feeling bad before your period. But when it goes in the DSM, it's a mental illness. We're not talking about PMS and food cravings and bloating and breast tenderness. We're talking about a mental illness. And that's what they said. They said, we're not talking about PMS. We're talking about a very tiny number of women who actually get very seriously mentally ill just before their period. Now, the research, believe me, people had tried to prove that women go crazy once a month.
Uh-huh.
There are a lot of people who wanted to believe that. They did lots of research, and they couldn't find any evidence of that. They couldn't even find any evidence that women are more likely to get depressed just before their periods than any other time of the month. And there is research showing that men often go through cyclical changes in mood. But nobody was suggesting putting that in the DSM, you understand. So anyway, they proposed putting premenstrual dysphoric disorder, or PMDD, in the DSM. And they had a debate at one of their conventions because a group of women got together and we said, this is horrible, this is terrible, you can't pathologize women in this way, and there's no research even to support the claim that there is such a thing as a premenstrual mental illness. And of course women feel bad sometimes before their periods, but are you going to want to say that if a guy gets bloated or is getting food cravings or is feeling more down than at other times, now we're going to put that in the DSM? No, nobody was suggesting that. So
you were also saying that there's a lot of research about testosterone and different kinds of behaviors that are associated with that are more male gender identified.
Well, we know. I mean, quite apart from the work on testosterone is very confusing because people think that people have tended to excuse violent and aggressive behavior in men by saying, well, it's their testosterone, they can't help it, poor dears. Whereas it's been shown for sure that if you behave in a more dominant and aggressive way, your testosterone level will then go up. So it's not just that testosterone leads to aggression and violence, but for sure what's been shown is that men are more likely than women to get very angry and very irritable. And anger and irritability were two of the criteria they listed under PMDD. But you see, men couldn't get that diagnosis, right? So what then happened was that at this debate, some people talked about some brilliant research that they did, where they showed that the symptoms that were supposedly the symptoms of PMDD, that men reported having them as often as women, and that women who said they had no problems premenstrually reported having these symptoms as often as women who said they had problems premenstrually. So that comes about as close as you could possibly come to proving there's no such thing as premenstrual dysphoric disorder. How could we put this in the DSM? Well, they did it anyway. And they put it in, because there was so much protest, they created a new category, a new appendix in the book that they said was for categories requiring further study. But they gave it the label, they gave it the numerical the number to go with it, with a decimal point. They had a list of criteria, and they had a cutoff point, just like they do with all the other categories. And they did not say in that special appendix, don't apply this diagnosis to anybody. There's nothing to keep anybody from using it, and they did. They also put it in the main part of the book, and that's a whole other thing. They lied and said that they didn't. It wasn't in the main part of the text. It was just in this provisional appendix. Now, of course, some women are unhappy, but what had been shown was that women who experience themselves as being more irritable, more angry, and so on right before their periods, what they hadn't been shown to have hormonal differences, but what had been found was that they were more likely to be in awful life situations, to be living with an abuser, to be being harassed at work, to be very poor, to have real-life problems. So, of course your hormones change before your period, and if your life is really terrible, then anything that changes can be just that much more to deal with. Bloating, you might ignore it unless you're having other real-life problems, and then it's sort of the last straw. But that's very different from saying the problem is hormonal and it's premenstrual. All right, so zipping right along here, what happened was it went in the DSM-3R, the third revised edition, which came out in 1987. And then this is when I was on the PMDD committee. They're trying to decide, do we put it in the 1994 edition, which is the one they've got now. And the research clearly showed there was no proof still that it was even a real thing. And we said it was dangerous because women who feel irritable or who feel angry or who feel depressed and so they can't be everybody's cheerleader like a woman's supposed to be, that they would say, oh my God, I have PMDD. And that's exactly what was happening. Well, when the DSM-4 came out in 1994, then the people who had been on the committee for PMDD got together, and they got money from Eli Lilly, which makes Prozac. And they had what they called a roundtable discussion, and then they wrote an article saying, new research shows, what they were saying was new since we had critiqued the other research, new research shows that PMDD is a real entity, and then they said, and Prozac is what helps it. When you read that article, you looked at the research they cited. Most of the research they cited was the old research that we had already showed, didn't prove what they wanted to prove. And the new research did absolutely nothing to support their claim that PMDD was a real entity. And then what happened was this article got published in a scholarly journal, and then an Eli Lilly representative went to the Food and Drug Administration with a woman who was on the PMDD committee for DSM. So just try to tell me they don't work together. And they went to the FDA, and here's what was happening. The Prozac patent was going to expire. And if you have a patent on a drug, you make millions of dollars in profits if it's a big seller, which Prozac is. And other drug companies can't sell the same thing. Their Prozac patent was going to expire. Now, the FDA approves drugs, so they don't just say, okay, we approve this drug. They say this drug is approved to treat condition A. Now, if you can show that it also helps with condition B, then you can ask for an extension on the patent, which in this kind of case is worth millions of dollars in profits. And it also means that people who are taking the drug are paying a lot more because they can't buy there is no generic version available. So they went to the FDA, the Eli Lilly and the DSM person, they went to the FDA and they said, we want you to approve Prozac because it helps people who have PMDD. The FDA did not ask whether PMDD was a real entity. If Eli Lilly had said, we want you to approve this drug because it helps with this newly discovered cancer Q, the FDA would have said, cancer Q, we never heard of this. Let's see the proof that there is a cancer Q. They didn't say that. And so all that happened was that an FDA committee listened to the Eli Lilly and the DSM person, and then they voted that Prozac helps people with PMDD and it doesn't hurt them. Prozac gets approved to treat PMDD, this non-existent entity.
And the money starts flowing.
And I should tell you, by the way, the European Union has an equivalent of the FDA, and they looked at the same research that the FDA looked at and said Prozac should not be used to treat PMDD because the research shows it's not a real entity.
Yeah, it's always very interesting to compare what's going on in the U.S. with mental health issues to what's going on in Europe. Paula, it's just so sad. We've got about 10 minutes left in the show, but I just want. I mean, if you want to finish that up, but I also
let me finish this up really quickly. All right, so because what people need to know is Eli Lilly then started making a version of Prozac. The ingredients are absolutely identical. And they started making it instead of in green and white, in pink and purple, and they named it Sarafem, Sarafem. See how feminine that sounds.
Yeah.
And then you may have seen the commercials. They showed women looking absolutely nuts, wild with rage for no good reason. And then the voiceover said, "You may think you have PMS, but you really have PMDD." So every woman, I mean, let's face it, girls and women are still socialized. We're not supposed to get angry, ever.
Right.
Every woman who feels she's not feminine enough because she's not sweet enough is liable to watch that and say, "Oh my God, that must be what's wrong with me." And sure enough, women in droves went to their gynecologists, their GPs, and their therapists and asked for prescriptions for Sarafem.
And even women who didn't buy into the drug, they're still getting educated in a certain way of seeing themselves by seeing the advertising.
Beautifully said.
Yeah,
beautifully
said. I just wanted to give you, I really want to have you back on the show because it's just, there's so much we can talk about. It's so powerful. I want to give you a couple of choices for different directions that we can go on. I know you've been doing recent work and research around the impacts of war on psychology, and I wanted to see if you wanted to talk about that. But I also wanted to ask you if you wanted to say more about how, because we've talked about how diagnosis, it really has no scientific validity, but how it actually harms people, or it can harm a lot of people. And just to point people to a website that you've created, which is psychdiagnosis.net, and it's linked right from the top of the Freedom Center homepage, because you're doing work on trying to create congressional hearings about how harmful psychiatric diagnosis is.
And let me say, some people say, "Oh, the diagnosis helped me because I got my therapy paid for." We can talk about both of those topics, because the second one's easy and fast. People have lost custody of their children because of having a psychiatric diagnosis.
Yeah.
They've lost jobs or not been hired, although that's supposed to be an illegal reason. They have had skyrocketing health insurance premiums because now they have a pre-existing condition. It may just be adjustment disorder. They just left home to go away to college and they're sad, right? Could be something very mild, but pre-existing condition. So now they have higher health insurance premiums, or they're denied premiums altogether. People have lost the right to make decisions about their medical and legal affairs because of having just any diagnosis. So I think we should have congressional hearings. On the website, there's a petition you can sign, or your group can sign, endorsing the call for congressional hearings. But I have to tell you, this is going nowhere at this point because Congress doesn't want to deal with it. The media have not picked up on this. I've tried to get them interested in doing this. Nobody's interested in it. And but we're still hoping. And I think we should have hearings so that people can talk about how they have been harmed or helped by psychiatric diagnosis.
Well, that's important to understand, because the Freedom Center doesn't tell people, look, you have to stop believing in your diagnosis. All we say is this, is that if you want to label yourself bipolar or schizophrenic or PMDD or wherever you want to label yourself, that's great. We have a problem with people imposing labels on other people, and we have a problem with the false science that goes around it. So we're all for accurate information. Sure, tell people what is the reality of these diagnoses, and then let them sort out for themselves how to define their own experience, rather than having some authority figure who's using a phony scientific pretense use this label on you without your choice or your decision being involved at all.
Right, but to try to make sure that people are making informed decisions is so hard, because the establishment is so powerful, and people think, well, I'm not an expert, what do I know? And who am I to question?
Well, they're not experts either. That's the key thing that we have to learn about mental health. You learn very quickly that they don't know what they're doing. It's true of physical health as well. Actually, there's a lot of stories that people, friends of mine who just have been diagnosed with horrible illness, and then doctors start just throwing pills at them, and they're like, oh, let's put some more change in the slot machine here and see if you get better. But it's especially extreme in psychiatry and mental health. Do you want to say really quickly give us a little teaser on war and psychology, and how also maybe point people to some more resources on that, because I know it's a very important topic at this point.
All right. Let me try and say something briefly this way. I was spokesperson for the Association for Women in Psychology for a while, And right before this country started, before we invaded Iraq, we were talking about what could we as psychologists do. And what struck me was this, that I think if we could ask the United States as a country, do you think that vets coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan are going to be upset? Are they going to be, suffering emotionally? People would say, oh, well, of course. And if you said, well, what do we do about that? Most people would probably say, oh, well, we know what that is. That's post-traumatic stress disorder. We know about PTSD, and what you do about that is you send them off to see therapists. Now, about a year and a half ago, I wrote an op-ed piece that was printed in the Washington Post and some other papers in which I said, look, did we not learn from the Vietnam War? Did we not learn from the first Gulf War? There is only so much of the emotional carnage of war that psychologists can fix. And if we say you have PTSD, that's a mental illness. And so we add to people's burdens. They're already anguished and frightened because of what's happened to them over there. And if we now add to that burden, oh, and you're mentally ill, the implication is, well, you should have gotten over it by now. So what if you saw your buddy blown to bits, or you realized you killed a child? You're upset. Well, that's a mental illness. Go see a therapist.
Something is wrong with you.
Yeah, what would exactly be a healthy response?
Right. What it might be a healthy response to get sick and get ill and to fall apart when you face with those kinds of things. The unhealthy response might be to just keep going.
Right. And that's what the Army's trying to get people to do. They're putting people on Prozac over there and trying to keep them going. But also, if you say, go see a therapist, then the message is very clearly, we want to isolate you in talking about this. We don't want to hear it. And of course, isolation makes all of these kinds of things worse. And it means that as a nation, we never have to face what war does to people. And I think that all of us should be saying, as these vets come back, if you want to talk about what happened to you over there, what you saw over there, how you're feeling now, I will listen for as long as you want to talk. It's the least I can do after what you went through, because we need to provide that kind of listening community for them. And we need to say to them, I don't think you're crazy. I'd be terrified, too. I would be sick at heart, too, if I had been through that.
And yet that's not the option that's likely to happen, because that has a political dimension to it, because then people are talking together about the horrors of war rather
exactly
than,
right.
And because it's not about what the media is telling us, it's not about Hollywood films, it's about people that you sit with and you see what has happened to them and you hear their stories, and that's going to be threatening to people who want to make war. So once again, we're at psychiatry and psychology as a social control device. So what sort of solutions? I mean, are there people who are making initiatives and challenging this on the congressional level, or trying to point out that this is not
what they're mostly doing? I mean, well-meaning members of Congress are trying to get more and more money for the VA, to hire more therapists, to do more treatment for PTSD, and so on. And I'm not saying that people shouldn't have the option of going to talk to a therapist about these things, but that can't be all.
Exactly.
And also the therapists, and as well as the rest of us, need to be saying, we don't think that you're mentally ill.
Exactly. I mean, this is one of the difficulties, I think, of doing the kind of work that we're doing, Paul, is that there tends to be in the progressive movement among liberals, there's this sort of view of like more services, more money is better. Mm-hmm. And I definitely think that the cutbacks that have been going on since Reagan and Bush, and we need to not have these cutbacks, and we need more services, but we also think about what kinds of services.
That's exactly right.
And are we buying into the pharmaceutical company's psychiatric establishment agenda, which we may very well be if we're just saying we need treatment for PTSD that's traditional therapy and pharmaceuticals for people, because they should have that option, clearly, but we've narrowed down our discussion when we're not looking at the negative way that traditional mainstream approaches to trauma of war, whatever kind kind of psychological condition has on people, the way in which that there need to be some kind of options. And I think it makes our work more difficult because it's a little bit more complicated than just saying we need more money for services. I mean,
that's right. That's exactly
well,
right.
listen, we're at 7:00. I really, this has been, I mean, there's so much we could talk about. We could spend hours and hours. I really want to get you back on the show. And
I'd love to.
It's just been a real honor. And to get in touch with Paul, I guess the best way is to go to psychdiagnosis.net. Is that,
right.
I mean, that's your main sort of web portal, and people can also get in touch with the Freedom Center if they're interested more in Paula's work, and check out her books. They Say You're Crazy: How the World's Most Powerful Psychiatrists Decide Who's Normal is a fantastic resource. Paula, thank you very much for
Thank you.
coming.
I just want to say I don't really do therapy myself anymore. So if people are wanting me to be their therapist, then they should just know that ahead of time.
Okay, so don't email Paula saying be my therapist, but she has a lot of resources on the web, and do check out psychdiagnosis.net. Thank you very much, Paula Caplan. And this is, you're listening to WXOJLP Northampton 103.3 FM.
I am the girl you know can't look you